It was an ordinary afternoon. I was standing on a sidewalk outside a small neighborhood park, doing what people do when they have nowhere urgent to be. Looking at my phone, watching cars pass, thinking about nothing important. And then I heard a voice, small, excited, getting closer. "Daddy!" I didn't turn around at first. Why would I? I don't have children. I never have. "Daddy!" This time the voice was right behind me. I turned, and a little girl, maybe 4 years old, was running straight toward me with both arms open. She had a pink jacket, one untied shoelace, and the kind of smile children have before they learn that the world sometimes gives them reasons to hold back. She was looking directly at me, not past me, not beside me, at me. And for one strange second, I did something I still think about. I opened my arms. I almost bent down to catch her. My body reacted before my mind understood what was happening. Then she stopped, right in front of me. She stared at my face, and her smile disappeared. Not slowly, instantly, like somebody had turned off a light. She looked confused. I looked confused. Neither of us said anything. Then she took one small step backward, and I understood she had mistaken me for someone else. Her father. A man shouted her name from somewhere behind me. She turned, and there he was, maybe 20 yards away, walking quickly toward us, waving one hand. She ran to him. He picked her up. He looked at me with an embarrassed smile and called out, "Sorry about that." I laughed and told him it was fine, and it was. At least it should have been. A child made a mistake. Her father found her. Nobody was hurt. The entire thing lasted maybe 10 seconds. So why did I stand there after they left? Why could I still feel the shape of an embrace that never actually happened? Why, for that tiny fraction of a second before she realized I was the wrong man, did being called Daddy feel strangely familiar? Have you ever had a moment like that? Something happens that should mean absolutely nothing. A stranger says a sentence, a song starts playing, you smell something you haven't smelled in 30 years, you notice a light on in an upstairs window, and somehow your mind refuses to let it go. Why? What is the brain trying to do in those moments? And what happens when something accidentally touches a part of you that you didn't even know was waiting to be touched? Stay with me. Because the little girl running toward me was strange, but that wasn't the part that stayed with me. What happened over the next few days made me realize that sometimes the most important questions in our lives begin with events that look completely meaningless. I started walking home. The park was only 15 minutes from my house. I had walked that route dozens of times, but that afternoon I noticed everything. A father lifting a bicycle out of the trunk of his car, a teenage boy arguing with his mother, an older couple sitting outside a cafe without speaking, a woman holding the hand of a little boy while waiting to cross the road. Maybe those things had always been there. I just hadn't been looking. Isn't that strange? Nothing changes. And suddenly, everything looks different. That little girl had called me one word, Daddy, and now I was seeing fathers everywhere. I told myself it was coincidence. You buy a red car, and suddenly it feels like everybody drives a red car. Your attention changes. The world doesn't. Simple. But then another question appeared. Why had I opened my arms? I knew she wasn't my daughter. At least my conscious mind knew. There was no forgotten child, no secret family, no mystery there. So why did my body respond before I had time to think? Maybe you've experienced something similar. Someone drops a glass and your hand moves before you decide to catch it. You hear your name in a crowded room and immediately turn. A child stumbles, and your whole body leans forward even though you're 10 feet away. There are reactions that happen before explanation. For half a second, we act before we become the person who explains why we acted. And that fascinated me. What else do we do before we know why we're doing it? How much of your life has been decided by a reaction that your conscious mind only explained afterward? Think about the person you married, the job you stayed in, the friend you trusted instantly, the stranger you disliked for no clear reason, the city that felt like home before it was home. How many times did the feeling arrive first and the explanation come later? By the time I reached my street, I had turned 10 seconds in a park into an interrogation of my entire life. That sounds ridiculous when I say it out loud, but maybe you know exactly what I mean. Sometimes the mind grabs onto something because it has been waiting for an excuse. I reached my house, put my keys in the bowl near the door, took off my shoes, and went into the kitchen. Everything was normal, and then I opened a cabinet. Inside was a blue ceramic mug. There was nothing special about it. I'd used it hundreds of times. But that day, for some reason, I remembered where it came from. My father gave it to me. Not as a gift exactly. It had been his. Years ago, I was visiting him and made coffee. I reached for that mug. He said, "Take it. You always use that one anyway." That was it. No sentimental speech, no meaningful pause, just a mug. My father was like that. He could care deeply about you and make it sound like he was discussing the weather. He died 11 years ago, and standing in my kitchen holding that mug, I suddenly remembered something I hadn't thought about in decades. I was 8 years old. My father had come home late. I didn't understand jobs then. I didn't understand bills or deadlines or what adults carry into a house without putting it down at the door. I only understood faces, and his face looked exhausted. He opened the front door. I ran toward him. I remember doing it without thinking, exactly like that little girl. Arms open, full speed, certain I would be received. And he caught me. That's the memory. Nothing dramatic. He didn't spin me around. He didn't give some perfect movie father speech. He just picked me up. I remember his jacket was cold. I remember the smell of outside air. And I remember putting my head against his shoulder. Why had I forgotten that? More importantly, had I really forgotten it? Because the memory came back almost complete. It was as if it had been sitting somewhere inside me, untouched, waiting for the right key. And apparently, the key was a 4-year-old stranger shouting one word in a park. What memories are sitting inside you right now that you think are gone? What could bring them back? A voice? A room? A name? A hand on your shoulder? We like to imagine memory as a library. Events go in. Years later, we pull the correct book off the shelf, but anyone who has lived long enough knows it doesn't feel like that. Memory behaves more like weather. It moves, it changes shape, it disappears and comes back. Sometimes an entire decade feels blurry, while one Tuesday afternoon from 40 years ago remains sharp enough to touch. Why that Tuesday? Why that face? Why that sentence? I sat at the kitchen table with the blue mug in front of me and tried to remember more about my father. And here is where something uncomfortable happened. The first memories that appeared weren't the good ones. They were moments when he was distracted, tired, quiet. Times I had wanted him to say something and he didn't. Times I interpreted his silence as disappointment. Have you ever noticed how easily childhood turns incomplete information into permanent conclusions? A parent is quiet. A child thinks, "I did something wrong." A parent is working all the time. A child thinks, "Work matters more than I do." A parent doesn't know how to express affection. A child thinks, "Maybe I'm difficult to love." Then the child becomes an adult. But the conclusion often comes along. We get taller, older, more sophisticated. We learn words like responsibility, stress, trauma, sacrifice, exhaustion. But somewhere underneath all of that, an 8-year-old interpretation can still be quietly directing traffic. I wondered how many things I had believed about myself because a child had explained an adult world with the only tools he had. That question bothered me. So I did what people do when a question bothers them. I tried to distract myself. I made dinner, I watched television, I answered emails, I went to bed. But the next morning, I thought about the girl again. Not the memory of my father. The girl. Specifically, the moment her expression changed, she ran toward me completely certain. Then she looked at my face and understood she had made a mistake. And do you know what she did? She adjusted. That was all. She didn't stand there for 20 minutes defending her original decision. She didn't decide I should become her father because she had already run all that way. She didn't blame the sidewalk. She didn't insist that reality changed to protect her from embarrassment. She looked. She understood. She turned around. How much easier would life be if adults could do that? How many years have you spent trying to make the wrong thing become right, because admitting the mistake felt worse than continuing it? A relationship, a career, a friendship, a belief, a version of yourself. Why are we so good at recognizing wrong directions when they belong to other people, and so bad at recognizing our own? I kept thinking about the way she turned. There was almost no hesitation. For her, being wrong wasn't an identity. It was information. That may be one of the abilities we lose as we get older. A child can say, "That's not my dad," and run the other way. An adult says, "I've already spent 15 years here. I've already given everything to this person. I've already told everyone this is what I want. I've already become this kind of person." And suddenly the distance we've traveled becomes a reason to keep going in the wrong direction. Have you ever stayed somewhere because leaving would force you to admit how long you should have been gone? That question followed me for the next 2 days. Then, on the third day, something happened that made the entire story change. I went back to the park. I wish I could tell you there was some profound reason. There wasn't. I had errands nearby. It was a nice afternoon, and maybe some part of me wanted to return to the scene. You know how sometimes you revisit a place where something happened, even when there's nothing left to find. Maybe we expect the location to explain itself. I walked along the same path, past the same benches, and then I saw them, the girl and her father. They were sitting together near a tree. I recognized her pink jacket first. She was crouched near the ground, completely fascinated by something I couldn't see. Her father sat on the bench watching her. I stopped, not close enough for them to notice me, just far enough away that I could observe without becoming part of their afternoon. And for a moment, I felt ridiculous. What was I doing, watching strangers because their daughter had mistaken me for someone 3 days earlier? I almost walked away. Then the girl stood up, ran several feet towards something, came back, said something to her father, and climbed onto the bench beside him. He barely moved. He just shifted over to make room. That tiny movement affected me more than it should have. He made room. That was all. And suddenly I realized I had spent 3 days thinking about the wrong person. I had thought about the girl, her mistake, my reaction, my father, my childhood. But I had barely thought about her actual father. The man who had been behind me that afternoon, the man she was trying to reach. What had that moment looked like to him? His daughter runs toward a stranger and shouts, "Daddy!" Maybe he laughed, maybe it frightened him, maybe it had happened before. But when she realized the mistake and ran back, he didn't make her feel foolish. He simply picked her up. He received her after she had run in the wrong direction, and that opened another question. Who has done that for you? Who was still there after you made the wrong choice? Who answered the phone after telling you not to call that person? Who gave you a room after the relationship collapsed? Who lent you money when your brilliant plan failed? Who listened to you complain about the same problem for the 10th time? Who watched you run confidently toward the wrong thing and still made room when you came back? We remember dramatic people, the ones who leave, the ones who betray, the ones who hurt us. But what about the quiet people who stay? Why does the mind sometimes give more space to the person who broke us than to the person who helped put us back together? You probably have someone like that in your life. Maybe you haven't spoken to them in months, maybe years, maybe they're gone now. And only after they disappeared did you realize how often they had been standing a few steps behind you, waiting without demanding attention. I watched the father and daughter for another minute. Then I kept walking. I didn't speak to them. I didn't need to. But that evening, I did something I hadn't planned. I called my older sister. We talk, but not often enough. You know those relationships where nothing is wrong, so you assume there's no urgency. That's dangerous. Nothing being wrong can make you believe you have unlimited time. She answered on the fourth ring. "What happened?" she asked. That was her first sentence. I laughed. Why does something have to have happened? Because you never call at this hour. She was right. I almost invented a reason. Instead, I said, "Do you remember Dad coming home when we were kids?" There was a pause. "What do you mean?" "Just coming home. After work." She laughed a little. "That's a strange question." "I know." Then she said something I didn't expect. "You used to wait for him at the window." I didn't remember that. "What?" "You'd hear his car and run to the front window. Every day for a while." I told her I had no memory of doing that. She did. That disturbed me in a quiet way. Someone else was carrying a piece of my childhood that I had lost. How much of you exists only in other people's memories? Think about that. There are versions of you that you cannot access. Your mother remembers you at 3. A childhood friend remembers you at 12. Someone you dated remembers a version of you from 27 that no longer exists. A co-worker remembers the day you said something you forgot 5 minutes later. A stranger might remember the kindness you don't remember giving. A person might still be hurt by words you barely remember saying. We spend our lives thinking we are the central archivists of our own existence, but we aren't. Pieces of us are scattered across other people. Some people are carrying moments from your life that you lost years ago, and you are carrying moments from theirs. My sister told me more. She remembered my father once. Arriving home with a small wooden airplane he had bought at a gas station because I had been asking for one. I had forgotten. She remembered me falling asleep on his chest during a movie. I had forgotten. Then I asked her something. "Do you remember him being unhappy?" She didn't answer immediately. "Sometimes. I always thought he was disappointed in me." Another silence. Then she said, "He thought he was disappointing you." I didn't say anything. Have you ever heard one sentence that rearranged an entire room inside your head? He thought he was disappointing you. For years, I had carried an interpretation. My father was distant because something about me wasn't enough. Now my sister was giving me another possibility. Maybe he had been distant because he believed he wasn't enough. Same silence. Two completely different stories. How often does that happen? Two people sit across from each other. One thinks they don't care about me. The other thinks I don't know how to show them how much I care. One person pulls away because they feel rejected. The other sees the withdrawal and assumes they are unwanted. Both protect themselves. Both create the exact distance they were afraid of. And years later, both tell different stories about why they stopped speaking. How many relationships are built not on what happened, but on what each person thought was happening? My sister and I talked for almost an hour. Before hanging up, she said, "You're making me miss him." I apologized. She said, "No, that's not a bad thing." After the call, I sat in the dark living room. And another question came. Why do we treat missing someone as if it's a problem to solve? When somebody dies, People tell you eventually it gets easier. Maybe it does. But easier is a strange word. You don't stop missing them. You become more skilled at carrying the missing. At first, the absence is a room you cannot leave. Years later, it becomes something you carry in your pocket. Most days you forget it is there. Then a little girl runs toward you and shouts, "Daddy!" And suddenly your hand touches that old weight again. Is that sadness? Maybe, but not only sadness. There was gratitude there, too. For a moment, I could remember what it felt like to be small enough to believe my father could catch anything. What a strange privilege memory is. It hurts because something mattered. Would you really want a life where nothing hurt to remember because nothing had been worth losing? I don't think I would. That night, I looked for old photographs. I have boxes of them, real photographs. The kind you can hold. Most people under a certain age will never understand how strange it is to open a box and discover 20 years with no search bar. You don't type a name, you dig. Birthday parties, Christmas mornings, people you haven't thought about in years, rooms that no longer exist, furniture that seemed permanent, cars everybody forgot, faces at the edge of photographs that once had entire lives connected to yours. I found a picture of my father and me. I was probably 7. We were standing beside a lake. I was holding a fishing rod badly. He was looking at me instead of the camera. I stared at his face. Do you know what happens when you become older than your parents were in your childhood memories? It is disorienting. As a child, your father at 38 looks ancient, permanent, finished. Then one day you are 50, 60, maybe 70, and you look at a photograph of him at 38 and realize something almost embarrassing. He was young. He didn't know what he was doing either. He was improvising adulthood while you were using him as proof that adults had answers. What did your parents pretend to understand because you needed them to? What frightened them while they told you everything was fine? What dreams did they quietly abandon? What arguments happened after you went to sleep? What bill sat unopened? What diagnosis did they not tell you about? What apology did they never learn how to say? We turn parents into characters because children need simple stories. Dad was strict, Mum was anxious, Dad was absent, Mum worried too much, Grandpa was angry, Grandma never complained. But people are not one sentence, neither are you. So why do we reduce the people who raised us to the easiest explanation we created before we understood what being human cost? I kept looking through photographs, and I noticed something. In almost every picture somebody was missing, not missing from life, missing because they were taking the photograph. My mother, my father, my uncle, me. There is always someone behind the camera, someone participating without appearing. Isn't life like that? We notice who is in the frame. We rarely ask who made the frame possible, who cooked the meal, who drove everyone there, who paid for the trip, who stayed sober, who cleaned after everybody left, who made sure the birthday happened. Who was behind the camera while everybody else became a memory? Maybe this is why quiet people are so easily overlooked. Their contribution hides itself. The loudest absence gets our attention. Quiet presence becomes furniture, until it isn't there anymore. And then suddenly the empty chair has a name. I found another photo. My father was holding me when I was a baby. I don't remember that day, obviously, but there I was, completely asleep against him. He looked terrified, not unhappy, terrified. The photograph made me laugh. His hands were holding me like I was a complicated object with no instruction manual. For the first time in my life, I didn't see my father. I saw a young man who had just become someone's father and was probably wondering whether he was capable of it. And then the little girl in the park came back into my mind. For 1 second, she had looked at me as if I were the person responsible for making the world safe. That is an enormous thing to place on a stranger. It is an enormous thing to place on a parent, too. Children do it without asking permission. To them, parents are not people at first. They are weather, shelter, the rules of the universe. A father walking into a room can change the emotional temperature of the entire house. A mother's face can tell a child whether the world is safe before a single word is spoken. No wonder we spend so much of adulthood trying to understand childhood. We learned reality by watching imperfect people pretend to know what reality was. And then we blamed ourselves for not becoming perfect. The next morning, I woke up with a thought that made me uncomfortable. I had spent days thinking about being a son, but there was another reason the word daddy might have affected me. I never became one. I never had children. That sentence is easy to say now. I never had children, but a life without something is rarely one clean decision. When I was younger, I assumed there would be time. Then I was focused on work. Then there were relationships that didn't last. Then years passed. Then one day, the question stopped being when and quietly became will I? Then eventually it became something nobody asked anymore. Have you noticed how life closes doors without making a sound? We imagine important choices as dramatic crossroads, two roads, a decision, music. But often there is no moment. You don't decide, I will never live in another country. You just keep renewing the lease. You don't decide, I will lose touch with my best friend. You just postpone calling. You don't decide, I won't have children. You just keep living until one day possibility has changed shape. What in your life ended without you noticing the final moment? What was the last dinner with someone you loved? The last time your child asked to be carried? The last day you drove to a job you hated? The last conversation with a friend who slowly disappeared? We almost never know when something is happening for the last time. Maybe that's mercy. If we knew, we would be unable to behave naturally. Imagine knowing this is the last ordinary breakfast with your mother, the last time your son falls asleep on the couch at home before moving away, the last time your dog waits at the door. The knowledge would crush the ordinary moment. So life hides, endings inside normal days, only memory labels them later. That little girl had shown me, for 1 second, a version of my life that never existed, not better, not worse, just different. A daughter running toward me kneeling to catch her, a word I had never belonged to. Daddy. Was I grieving something I never had? Can you miss a life you never lived? Most people have one, maybe several. The career you almost chose, the person you almost married, the city you nearly moved to, the child you imagined, the business you almost started, the trip you kept postponing, the version of your body before it changed, the relationship with a parent that might have existed if both of you had understood each other sooner. Do those lives disappear completely? Or do we carry them beside the one we actually chose? I don't know, but I think that's why certain moments can hit so hard. For 3 seconds, reality accidentally opens the wrong door. You glimpse a room that could have been yours, then the door closes, and you keep walking. That afternoon I went for another walk. Not to the park, I chose a different route. I didn't want to turn this into some strange ritual. But while walking, I noticed an elderly man standing outside a grocery store. He was holding 2 bags. A younger woman came out, saw him, and immediately took one. Nothing remarkable, but they exchanged a look. It was familiar, practiced, the kind of tiny cooperation built by years. And I wondered how many of the most important moments in a life would look completely boring to anyone else. We wait for meaning to arrive dramatically, a wedding, a funeral, a diagnosis, a graduation, a birth. But most of life happens between those things. Someone remembers how you take your coffee. Someone leaves the porch light on. Someone saves you the last piece. Someone notices you are quieter than usual. Someone sends a message when you haven't spoken in months. Someone sits beside you without forcing conversation. Why are we so bad at recognizing love when it doesn't announce itself? Maybe because movies taught us to look for speeches. Real life often communicates in logistics. Text me when you get home. Did you eat? I filled your tank. I saw this and thought of you. Take my jacket. Call me when you get there. Some people never learn to say, I love you, in the language you wanted, but they may have been saying it all along in a language you didn't recognize. That doesn't excuse every failure. Some people truly were absent. Some wounds are exactly what they look like, but others become more complicated with time, and perhaps maturity is partly the willingness to allow a story to become more complicated without pretending it didn't hurt. Can two things be true? Can someone love you and still fail you? Can you forgive someone without deciding what they did was acceptable? Can you miss a person you were right to leave? Can a childhood have been beautiful and painful? Can you be grateful for a life you still wish had gone differently? Adults spend so much time trying to force experiences into single categories: good, bad, success, failure, right person, wrong person. But maybe some of the hardest things to understand are hard precisely because they contain opposites. The little girl ran to the wrong man, but somehow the mistake gave me something I needed. Wrong person, right moment. How many times has that happened to you? A job you hated introduced you to your closest friend. A relationship that failed taught you what you needed. A missed flight changed a decision. A rejection pushed you somewhere you would never have gone voluntarily. Be careful with this idea. Not every painful thing secretly happens for a reason. Sometimes pain is simply pain. Sometimes a mistake is simply a mistake. But human beings do something remarkable. We make meaning after the fact. The event doesn't arrive with meaning attached. We add it. That frightened me a little. Because if meaning can change, what else in my past might change without the facts changing at all? My father was still tired. He was still quiet. I was still a child who misunderstood him. Nothing about history had changed, but one sentence from my sister had changed the shape of it. He thought he was disappointing you. What if there are stories in your life waiting for one missing piece? What if the person you think abandoned you believed you had already left? What if the apology you waited for was never spoken because the other person didn't understand there was an injury? What if someone still thinks you hate them because of a day you barely remember? I decided to test something. I took out my phone and searched for an old friend named Daniel. We had been close in our 20s. Then life happened. Different jobs, different cities, relationships, no fight, no betrayal. We simply stopped. I found him online. I stared at his name for several minutes. Why is it so difficult to message someone after a long silence? Nothing is physically preventing you, but each year adds weight. After 1 month you say, I should call. After 1 year, it's been too long. After 10 years, it would be strange now. When exactly does affection become archaeology? I sent him 3 words. Thought of you. He responded 20 minutes later. Still alive then? That was Daniel. Within an hour we were talking. At one point he said, I always thought you got too busy for me. I laughed. I thought you got too busy for me. There it was again. 2 people. Same silence. Opposite explanations. How many friendships end this way? Not with anger, with mutual hesitation. Each person waits for evidence that the other still cares. Neither gives it. Then both use the silence as proof. We spoke for 2 hours. When the call ended, I sat there wondering how absurdly close some lost things remain. Sometimes the distance between gone forever and back in my life is one message. Of course, not everything should be recovered. Some doors are closed because they need to be. But how do you know the difference between a door that should remain closed and one you're simply afraid to knock on? That is a harder question. And I don't have a clean answer. Maybe nobody does. But I began noticing a pattern. The girl had mistaken me for her father. I had mistaken my father's exhaustion for disappointment. My friend and I had mistaken mutual silence for indifference. How much of life is mistaken interpretation? Not lies, not deception, interpretation. We don't respond to reality directly. We respond to what we think reality means. Someone doesn't reply. You think they are angry. Someone looks distracted. You assume you're boring. Your child stops calling as often. You decide they no longer need you. Your partner says, "I'm fine." You believe the words or you believe the tone. Then you behave according to the meaning you created, and your behavior changes what happens next. You withdraw. They notice. They withdraw too. Now the misunderstanding has evidence. It begins feeding itself. What if some of the things you are certain about are simply stories that became convincing because you've repeated them for years? That question is dangerous, not because you should doubt everything, but because certainty feels safe. I know why she left. I know what he thought of me. I know why my mother treated me that way. I know what would have happened if I had chosen differently. Do you, or have you lived with the same explanation so long that familiarity feels like proof? A week passed. I didn't see the girl again. I thought the story was over. Then, one Saturday morning, I stopped at a small cafe near the park. I ordered coffee, and when I turned around, her father was standing behind me. He recognized me immediately. He laughed. "Hey, you're the other dad." I laughed too. "That's me." He apologized again. I told him there was nothing to apologize for. Then, because the universe apparently enjoys making ordinary conversations strange, he said, "She's done that before." I looked at him. "What?" "Run to the wrong person." He shook his head, smiling. "She sees the jacket, the walk, whatever, and she decides it's me." Something about that sentence made me curious. "How often?" "Maybe 3 times. Then he added, "She never hesitates." That was exactly what I had been thinking about. I told him she had made me think about that. He probably expected a joke. Instead, I said, "Adults hesitate a lot more." He looked at me for a second, then smiled. "Yeah, we learn too much." We stood there in silence. Then he said something simple. "My wife says our daughter trusts the world because she hasn't had a reason not to yet." That sentence stayed with me. Trusts the world because she hasn't had a reason not to yet. Is that what happens? Do we begin open and slowly build walls, or are the walls necessary? Maybe both. A 4-year-old can run toward the wrong stranger. An adult knows why that can be dangerous. Caution keeps us alive. But when does caution stop being protection and become confinement? When did you stop doing something because you were wisely careful? And when did you stop because one old disappointment taught you to expect every future experience to repeat it? That line is difficult to see from inside your own life. Someone betrays you. You become better at reading people. Maybe. Or maybe you become worse at trusting good ones. A business fails. You become realistic. Maybe. Or maybe fear learns to use mature vocabulary. A relationship ends. You tell yourself you're happier alone. Maybe you are. Or maybe you have built such a sophisticated explanation for avoiding vulnerability that nobody can question it, including you. I'm not telling you to run through life like a 4-year-old. That would be foolish. But I am asking something. Which parts of you became wiser, and which parts simply became scared? Can you tell the difference? The father took his coffee and started to leave. Before he did, I asked his daughter's name. "Emily," he said. Then he walked away. Emily. For some reason, knowing her name changed something. Until then, she had been the little girl, an event, a symbol. Now, she was Emily, a real person who would grow up. One day, she might not remember that afternoon at all. I probably won't exist in her memory. Maybe there will be no trace. But she changed my week, maybe more than my week. And that brought me to the strangest question of all. How many people have changed your life without ever knowing it? A teacher who said one sentence, a stranger who helped when your car broke down, a nurse who held your hand, a person who smiled when you were having the worst day of your year, a customer who complained and made you quit a job you should have left anyway, someone whose rejection redirected your entire life, someone you watched from across a room and never spoke to. Do they know? Probably not. And if strangers have altered your life unknowingly, how many lives have you altered without knowing? Maybe you were someone's reason not to quit. Maybe a compliment you forgot stayed with a person for 20 years. Maybe someone copied the way you handled a difficult moment. Maybe a child remembers you as the adult who listened. Maybe somebody went home feeling less invisible because you looked them in the eye. We want evidence that we mattered. Awards, messages, thank you speeches, people telling us what we meant to them. But most impact is invisible to the person who creates it. You drop stones into water and walk away before seeing how far the circles travel. What if you have mattered far more than you can prove? And what if the people you think didn't matter to you are still quietly shaping the way you live? That evening, I wrote Emily's name in a notebook. Not because I expected to see her again. I wrote, Emily, the girl who ran to the wrong father. Underneath, I wrote, what did I run toward? I sat there for a long time. What had I run toward? Work, definitely work. For years I treated being needed professionally as evidence that I was valuable personally. Those are not the same thing. I ran toward achievement, recognition, being dependable, being the person who never needed help. That one took me longer to admit. There is a strange pride in being the person everyone relies on. It feels like strength, but sometimes being indispensable is a way to avoid being vulnerable. If everyone needs you, you never have to ask whether they love you when you have nothing to provide. That question hit harder than I expected. How much of who you are was built to earn something you were afraid wouldn't be given freely? Love, approval, safety, respect, attention. We all have strategies. The funny one, the responsible one, the successful one, the easygoing one, the caretaker, the person who never complains, the person who always knows what to do. Maybe those traits are genuine, but sometimes they began as solutions. A child learns, people are calmer when I'm useful. So usefulness becomes identity. A child learns, I get attention when I achieve. Achievement becomes oxygen. A child learns, conflict is dangerous. Peacekeeping becomes personality. Decades later, we call it just who I am. But is it? Or is part of personality the history of what worked? I thought again about my father. He was useful, always, fixing things, driving somewhere, paying for something, solving problems. I rarely saw him ask for help. Maybe I learned more from that than I knew. Maybe we inherit behaviors nobody intentionally teaches, not through speeches, through repetition. What did you learn by watching? Not what your parents told you. What did they demonstrate? Did they say, family comes first, while giving everything to work? Did they tell you to speak up while avoiding every difficult conversation? Did they tell you money doesn't matter while worrying about it every night? Children learn contradictions fluently. Then we spend adulthood wondering why our beliefs don't agree with our behavior. I wrote another question. What am I teaching without speaking? That one made me wish I had children, just so I could worry about the answer. But then I realized we are all teaching somebody. Younger siblings, co-workers, friends, nieces, nephews, people who watch how we handle disappointment. You don't need children to become part of someone else's blueprint. Someone is learning what adulthood looks like by observing you. That's both beautiful and terrifying. A few days later, my sister sent me a photograph, another one I had never seen. My father was sitting on the porch. I was maybe 9 or 10. I was beside him. Neither of us was looking at the camera. We were just sitting. She wrote, "Found this after our conversation." I zoomed in. My father looked tired, but I noticed his hand. It was resting on my shoulder. I had spent years remembering his tired face. I had forgotten his hand. How often do we remember the expression and forget the hand, the criticism and forget the ride home, the argument and forget the 100 ordinary evenings? Pain is loud. Care is often repetitive. The mind notices disruption. Maybe that's why one cruel sentence can remain clearer than 1,000 quiet kindnesses. But if that is true, then perhaps remembering fairly requires effort. Not positive thinking, not rewriting history, fairness, allowing the whole picture back into the frame. What would change if you remembered someone as a complete person instead of only through the moment that hurt most? Again, some people do not deserve revision. Some harm should not be softened. But complexity is not forgiveness. Understanding is not surrender. You can say, "This hurt me," and also say, "There was more to them than the hurt." You can say, "I should have left," and also say, "There were good days." You can say, "I miss them," without saying, "I should return." Human beings want clean endings. Life rarely provides them. Maybe that's why we keep replaying certain memories. We aren't always searching for an answer. Sometimes we are trying to fit contradictory truths into the same room. Weeks had passed since Emily ran toward me. And by then, the event had become almost funny. A 4-year-old confused me with her father and accidentally caused an audit of my entire emotional life. But one final thing happened. Something small. Of course it was small. The entire story had taught me to pay attention to small things. I was leaving the grocery store one evening. Ahead of me was a man around my age walking with a teenage girl. She was looking at her phone. He was carrying most of the bags. They reached the parking lot. She stopped, suddenly turned around and held out her hand. He looked confused. Then she pointed at one of the bags. He handed her a package of cookies. She smiled. He said something. She rolled her eyes. They kept walking. That was it. But I found myself smiling, and then I realized something. For days, I had been thinking about the word daddy, as if fatherhood were a title attached to biology. But maybe the moment affected me because the word represents something much larger. To be someone safe. Direction. To be the person they expect to find when they run. Isn't that what many of us want, whether or not we have children? To be a place someone can return to. A friend, a partner, a brother, a sister, a neighbor. A person whose presence lowers the temperature of a room instead of raising it. Who are you safe for? That may be more revealing than asking who loves you. Who can make a mistake in front of you without being humiliated? Who can call when they have failed? Who doesn't have to perform strength around you? Who knows? You will make room on the bench. And if the answer is nobody, what would it take to become that person? Maybe this is what had bothered me from the beginning. For 1 second, Emily treated me as if I were safety. Then she looked closer and realized I wasn't the person she needed. And maybe somewhere inside me, I wanted to deserve the instinct even if I didn't deserve the title. That sounds sentimental. Maybe it is. But getting older changes what impresses you. When you are young, you think being admired is powerful. Later you begin to understand that being trusted is rarer. Admiration looks at you from a distance. Trust walks toward you with its arms open, and trust is frightening because it gives you something you can break. Who trusted you once? Did you handle it well? Who trusts you now? Do. You notice there are people in our lives whose trust became so familiar that we stop treating it as precious. A spouse who assumes you'll be there, a friend who calls when things fall apart, an adult child who still asks your opinion, a sibling who knows you'll answer. We complain about being needed, then one day nobody calls, and we realize how much meaning was hidden inside the inconvenience. That doesn't mean you must be available to everyone. Boundaries matter, but there is a difference between being used and being trusted. Wisdom is learning to recognize it before absence teaches you. I went home and looked at my father's photograph one more time, the one where his hand was on my shoulder. And I thought about all the questions I would ask if he could sit across from me for 1 hour. Were you scared? Did you think you were doing a good job? Did you know I was watching for your car? Did you know I thought your silence meant disappointment? Did you know I understood later? Did you know I forgive the things that need forgiving? Did you know I remember more now? But there was one question above all the others. Did you know I felt safe? I think he would have been surprised. Maybe that's the tragedy of so many relationships. We assume people know they don't. We assume our parents knew we loved them. Our friends know we appreciate them. Our children know we're proud. Our partners know they matter. Then why are we so reluctant to say the obvious? Why do we wait for funerals to become eloquent? Why can people describe someone beautifully after they die and struggle to say 3 sincere sentences while they're sitting across the table? Maybe because death removes the risk. The dead cannot reject your tenderness. The living can. Being sincere is dangerous because the other person might not respond the way you hope. So we hide behind jokes. Routine. I'm sure they know. Do they? Who in your life are you assuming knows? Something you have never actually said? Maybe after this video, tell them. Not because every story needs a lesson, but because some experiments are worth trying. There is one more thing I want you to consider. Imagine Emily 20 years from now. She won't remember me. She may not remember that park. Her father might tell the story someday. You used to run up to strangers because you thought they were me. She'll laugh. Maybe she'll be embarrassed. For her, it will be a childhood anecdote. For me, it became something else entirely. The same event can occupy completely different sizes in different lives. That person you think about every week may barely remember the conversation. The mistake you replay from 20 years ago may be forgotten by everyone else who was there. The kindness you barely noticed giving may have become someone else's permanent memory. Doesn't that change the way you think about embarrassment, about regret? We behave as if everyone is keeping a detailed record of our worst moments. They aren't. Most people are too busy carrying their own. Maybe the thing you still punish yourself for has already disappeared from everybody's life except yours. If so, why are you still serving the sentence? And on the other side, maybe something you forgot deserves to be remembered because it mattered to somebody. We have such incomplete access to our own impact. It makes humility necessary. You are probably less important in some stories than you imagine, and far more important in others than you will ever know. Both can be true. Months from now, maybe I'll stop thinking about Emily. Years from now, perhaps I'll forget her name. Memory does that. But I don't think I'll forget the feeling of turning around and seeing a child running toward me with absolute certainty, because that image has become attached to too many questions. What are we still running toward? What are we afraid to admit was the wrong direction? Who is waiting behind us? Whose quiet presence have we mistaken for permanence? What did our parents fail to say? What did we misunderstand because we were too young to interpret it differently? Which version of our past are we still living inside? Who are we safe for? What do we assume people already know? And perhaps most importantly, what would we do differently if being wrong stopped feeling like a verdict on who we are? Emily was wrong about me, completely wrong, and nothing terrible happened. She looked closer, adjusted, ran toward the right person. What a simple thing. What a difficult thing. Maybe there is something in your life right now that you already know isn't what you thought it was. A direction, a relationship, a belief, a resentment, a story you have told yourself for years. You don't need to destroy yourself for having believed it. Maybe you were working with the face you could see from a distance. Maybe now you're close enough to see clearly, and seeing clearly is not failure. It is simply the moment before you choose where to run next. I used to think changing your mind meant admitting weakness. Now I think refusing to change your mind after reality changes is much more dangerous. The little girl didn't lose anything by correcting herself. She found her father. Maybe adults make life harder because we attach identity to every direction. If this relationship fails, what does that say about me? If I leave this job, what does that say about the last 20 years? If I forgive this person, does that mean I was wrong to be angry? If I admit I misunderstood my father, does that erase the pain I felt as a child? No. Revision does not erase the earlier chapter. It simply means the story continued. You are allowed to understand at 60 what you couldn't understand at 20. You are allowed to look at a parent differently after becoming the age they were. You are allowed to forgive yourself for using the tools you had. You are allowed to miss people you shouldn't return to. You are allowed to be grateful and disappointed at the same time. You are allowed to decide the destination you chose years ago is no longer yours. Maybe wisdom isn't finally knowing where everything belongs. Maybe it is becoming less afraid of looking again. I started this story by telling you that a little girl ran toward me and yelled, "Daddy!" And I told you I don't have a daughter. That's true. But after everything that followed, I'm not sure the interesting part was that she mistook me for her father. The interesting part was how many things I had mistaken for something else. Exhaustion for rejection, silence for indifference, distance for lack of love, routine for permanence, being needed for being valued, fear for wisdom, old interpretations for facts, and perhaps that is why the moment stayed. A 4-year-old looked at me, realized she was wrong, and corrected herself in less than a second. It took me decades to do the same with some of my own stories. Maybe that's the question I want to leave with you, not, what have you gotten wrong? Everybody gets things wrong. The better question is this: what are you finally close enough to see clearly? Think about it. Maybe a person came to mind while you were listening. Maybe a parent, a child, someone you lost, someone you left, someone you still haven't called. Maybe it wasn't a person. Maybe it was a dream, a career, a version of yourself you're still trying to become, even though you stopped wanting that life years ago. You don't need to answer me, but don't answer yourself too quickly either. Some questions deserve to sit beside you for a while. That's what Emily's question did to me. She never asked it out loud. She just ran toward me. And sometimes that is how life asks its best questions. Not directly, not politely. It throws something strange into an ordinary afternoon and waits to see whether you notice. Most days we don't. We're distracted, busy, looking at the next thing. But every once in a while something slips through. A sentence, a photograph, a phone call, a little girl shouting one word that doesn't belong to you, and suddenly the ordinary day opens. You see your father differently. You call your sister. You find an old friend. You question an old story. You remember a hand on your shoulder that had been there all along. Nothing changes, and somehow everything does. If you're still here, I want you to do something before you leave. Not for me, for yourself. Think of one person who quietly made room for you when you were heading in the wrong direction. Someone who didn't need to save you. Someone who simply stayed close enough that you could find your way back. If they're still alive, maybe tell them. You don't need a speech. You don't need to explain this entire story. Just tell them you remember. Because one day, one of you will become a photograph, and every conversation you thought you could have later will suddenly have a final version. That isn't meant to make you afraid. It's meant to make today visible. And then think of one story about yourself that might deserve another look, not because it's definitely wrong, because you are not the same person who first interpreted it. Maybe you know more now. Maybe you understand exhaustion, parenthood, marriage, money, fear, grief, loneliness. Maybe you've become old enough to recognize that adults were never the finished creatures you imagined them to be. Maybe nobody is. Maybe all of us are still adjusting our direction after discovering that the person in front of us is not who we thought. That afternoon, Emily ran to the wrong man. She looked at me. She realized her mistake. She turned around, and behind me, her father was waiting. I think about that image often. The wrong person in front, the right person behind, and a child in the middle who doesn't waste time hating herself for getting confused. She simply runs again. Maybe there is something there for all of us. If this story made you think of something you haven't thought about in a long time, and tell me in the comments, not what you think the lesson is. Tell me what question it brought back. What is something in your life you are finally beginning to see differently? Maybe your answer becomes the next conversation we have here. And if you know someone who has spent years carrying an old interpretation of themselves, send this to them. Not because you know what they should do, because sometimes the right story reaches a place advice cannot. And if you want more conversations like this, subscribe. We're not here to pretend life has simple answers. We're here to notice the questions hiding inside ordinary moments, because sometimes the thing that changes you isn't the event you spent years preparing for. Sometimes it is 10 seconds on a sidewalk, a child with an untied shoelace, a stranger's embarrassed smile, a word that belonged to somebody else. Daddy. She was wrong, but somehow she still found exactly what I needed to see.